Hi, and welcome back to 7-Minute Futures, a short-form podcast where I ask thought leaders around the world for the future of technology and its impacts. I am Javier Paliero. Can traditional and alternative governance frameworks offer a path forward for platform regulation? Today's guest has very interesting ideas about this. Alejandro Mayoral Baños is a dedicated activist and academic, passionate about bridging indigenous peoples and digital technologies. He is currently the executive director at Access Now. So let's go to my first question. Looking 3 to 5 years down the road, what is the single most overlooked issue at the intersection of technology and human rights that will soon become impossible to ignore?
I think the single most overlooked issue at the intersection of technology and human rights is regarding the governance and ethical approach that has been developed by local and indigenous communities across the globe, especially regarding science and technology. This approach would benefit the digital rights movement because communities across the globe historically have an approach that incorporates the communal and the environmental aspect in the use of technology. Some of the aspects that I think will be benefited from the perspective of indigenous worldviews could be the intellectual property rights and how the use of communal data is being fostered in a lot of these communities. And this is an ongoing conversation that has been happening for several centuries about how information and data is shared for communal value, which is connected to the second approach that is very different in digital technologies, that every development and every indigenous technology is for the benefit of the community, but also connected to the environmental aspect, to Mother Earth. This is connected to the connection between the technology itself with nature. And I think digital technologies have failed to connect to the environmental aspect and how important that these technologies embody the environment and they consider the environment in their design. The next aspect is around the governance and especially around accountability. A lot of what happened on moderation and regulation of communal spaces, especially public spaces, and indigenous communities, local communities have faced that question in many different ways. And there is a lot of different approaches. For example, clans, responsibilities within the communities where it's not an obligation, it's a responsibility in the community member. But in this case, if we're talking about technologies, what are the responsibilities of the user towards the common, towards that community, towards the environment? I think that approach can bring accountability in these platforms, but it's always a struggle of the Western epistemologies and Western approaches to consider this as a way to address the challenges around digital technologies. Finally, I think there is also a great opportunity to learn from the lessons of the past. One big aspect of indigenous technologies is about intergenerational teaching or intergenerational learning and how that is passed generation over generation. And I think with digital tech, this would benefit future technologies. What were the problems of the past and how those problems were overcome? And learning in the intergenerational approach on how technologies were developed with the software communities, the open communities, how that learning aspect can pass generation over generation. In the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to become more and more evident. And especially when we are seeing a lot of the flaws and a lot of the threats that digital tech are becoming for a lot of communities across the globe.
And here's my second question. If you had the power to implement one hard reset, a radical change to a policy, a piece of technology, or a social norm to better protect digital rights, what would it be and why?
If I had the power to implement one hard reset, and a radical change into policy will be around the TRIPS agreement, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, and how through the World Trade Organization that was reinforced in many jurisdictions, because that transformed the world and how information now is managed and how a lot of power has been holding in the global minority. I think that legal background reinforced a lot of the concerns that we are facing today in the digital rights movement.
As you may have noticed, Alejandro's answers reveal a paradox at the heart of our digital interactions. On one hand, we heard about complex ethical frameworks from indigenous communities, models built on communal benefit, shared responsibility, and environmental balance. These could be lasting human-centric ways of governing knowledge that could offer alternatives to help solve our current crisis. On the other hand, we have the very tool that was supposed to protect innovation, global intellectual property law, that is acting paradoxically. That system, enshrined in agreements like TRIPS, is now the primary roadblock to implementing those more ethical and sustainable models. It locks us into a framework of individual ownership, control, and exclusion. This exposes a fundamental clash of worldviews: a digital architecture designed for the individual versus ancient wisdom designed for the community. And this isn't just an academic debate. There are powerful interests that keep the current system in place. States and corporations have little incentive to dismantle the centralized systems that give them power. This concentration of control has very real consequences. It creates digital infrastructures that can be easily surveilled and co-opted by authoritarian regimes, with tech companies that in some cases act as willing partners. This leaves us at a crossroads for our digital future. Will we continue down the path of a centralized authority, concentrating power in the hands of a few? Or will we find the courage to decenter our approach and build new norms of communal governance at scale? That's the core question. The conversation continues on my Substack at javierpaliero.substack.com. See you in the next episode.